I finished cutting out everything and I have a whole bunch of scraps left over. So like any good quilter, I have hung onto the larger pieces and they will become some note paper. And the smaller ones, unless you do crafting with small bits of paper, these I will just put into the recycle bin. And if you've laid out all your cutouts, you'll notice that they're all designed to kind of fit and work within each other. This one here, your large block, is going to be the largest block that we'll use in your quilt. And these other pieces can, if you're having trouble keeping them in an arrangement, you can use extra pages of your large block to help you keep your quilt blocks, your smaller pieces, in line with what your bigger block is going to be. I have my sticky tack all warmed up and I'm going to be using this to help hold each of my pieces down so they're not moving around on me. Let's talk about the big block here first. So a few reasons why you might want to use it. Larger blocks are great within quilting. They are awesome for featuring something that has a really large print. And in the purpose of our designing with these pieces, it also adds like a kind of like a plate that we can put our other pieces onto. And part of designing a quilt, sometimes you create a block, but then you want to be able to turn it in all different directions. And if your pieces aren't attached to something within that block, then it's going to be harder for you to move things around and change that direction. So I've printed out a few extras. I'm not sure how many I'm going to need. If you find that you need more of these large ones, go ahead and print out as many as you think that you'll need for this. So the first one, and I'm just going to build or use this like a plate, and I'm going to put my other blocks on it. I like the idea of some of these rectangles and kind of a medium-sized square. So I'm just going to put a little sticky tack on the back and stick that down, and on here. And another little bit on this larger rectangle. When you're designing a quilt, there's a few different ways that you can go about it. Sometimes you're just really inspired by the fabric choices that you have. I'm leaving these blank for now because I'm not quite sure what colors I want to put everything in yet. But for now, I have created one block. So a block within a quilt is the largest size piece that you're going to have, whether it's a single piece of fabric, if it's just on its own, or a grouping of smaller cut pieces of fabric to create that larger square. But a block is going to be always the same size within your quilt and then continuing to repeat that size all the way through. It's not a hard and fast rule. For the purpose of this quilt and learning to design and build your own quilt from scratch, we are going to keep it more simple and create a very same sized kind of block. So here's one idea. An example of a block that you might want to avoid, just because it's a little trickier to make, you could do something like this. And this is a block that looks really neat. However, when you go to actually piece it together, there's a whole piecing strategy involved with this, because you don't have easy lines where you can build something and then just keep adding to the outside edge. With one like this, you've got seams that you have to leave kind of unstitched, and then you can create this really cool wraparound block. So if you've done quite a bit of quilting before, you might like this and you want to try building your own quilt with whatever colorways you want. You can go ahead and do that, but to sew, this is not really a beginner or first quilt friendly sort of block. Okay, I came up with quite a few different block options. You might have come up with some that are the same, some that are similar, and because there's so many combinations, you might have something that I don't have on my table here. So that is what I came up with. The next part, once you've got these, is deciding on which ones you like. And if you're a newer quilter, I would say just keep it simple. The simpler, the better. The less cutting that you have to do, the less measuring, the less math. And if you're pretty brave and the math and all that doesn't really bother you, you can go ahead and make something more complex. But if you're someone who does tend to struggle with kind of that quilt math, keep your first ones on the simpler side. I've picked my 3 favorites, and the next thing to do once you have your favorites, whether it's 1 or 2 or 5, is to go ahead and make 2 or 3 more sets of your favorite ones. Once you have those, we're going to then start moving them around in different positions, whether they're running in this orientation or you choose to turn orientation. Some of them, like this one, can only have 2 orientations. This one can have 4. Each direction is going to provide a different look. And same thing with this one. It can also have a variety of different orientations within your quilt. So part of having multiples of them is to be able to match them up together, so you know if you want to have something going this way, or maybe you prefer a look that goes that way, or if you pick one block, you might choose to alternate directions that they are laying. There were 4 blocks in this set that I really liked, and I made 4 of each of them just so I could have enough to kind of lay them out in their own thing, and then to try mixing some of them up in different groups. So this one I'm going to try laying out like this, see what I get. And there's sort of a kind of other pinwheel thing going on here, and the other sets of 3 also have their own little spin happening. One more more bit that I'd like to add, especially if you're doing this larger block that runs in thirds. If this is a first to you quilt and you don't have a bunch of quilting tools like a rotary blade or a cutting mat or an acrylic ruler, you're going to find it really tedious to cut out all of these little squares and the medium squares and the large squares. So keep that in mind with your design idea, that if you don't have quilting tools to help make the cutting process easier and accurate, you're going to find the more like block intense pieces to be more frustrating. And with that said too, there's nothing wrong with a quilt that is just large blocks like this, and you can definitely create a color pattern within something like this that will still be really appealing. So something like this can have, you know, something unique in the middle, and whether you create like a tic-tac-toe game, or if you do these 9x9 blocks with different colors, you can use kind of a Sudoku idea to create each large 9 patch with its own color set so that there's no repeating color in each row or column. So definitely different ideas that you can do if you're having to cut out fabric with just a pair of scissors. This next set of blocks are going to be worked out in groups of 2. The larger blocks, everything was designed to work out in thirds. So I do have one that we can use as a plate, and when I was printing some additional of these blocks, I ended up printing out the whole file instead of just selecting this particular block. So I pulled out these and the rectangles and the squares, because you may choose to design blocks in these configurations. If seeing them like this is a little bit challenging for you, I'm going to show you that they really like how to build it, and so what this actually is in smaller chunks. So if you just take 2 of your rectangles, you can attach them like that, and it is the same as this. Because these are printed together on one page, compared to putting 2 cutouts together, you might find the cutout easier to work with just because it looks more like 2 separate pieces of fabric that will be coming together. And this can sometimes just feel like one thing with a line through it. And for the block of 4, it's same idea, just 4 pieces of fabric that are sewn together, and to create something called a 4 patch. So if you're able to process these 2 pieces as the same thing, and you want to save yourself some time with cutting out smaller blocks and putting them together, you can cut out one larger block that shows that configuration. The other thing that you could do, depending on what kinds of blocks you wanted to make, so let's say that you wanted a block with 1 rectangle and a block with 2 squares, you could just cut these ones in half and then have your two smaller squares just already kind of joined together on that paper. So this would save you a little bit of time, maybe a little bit less cutting. So I think that's pretty much it for these configuration options. You can either have your large square, two rectangles, a rectangle and two small squares, or 4 of your small squares together to create your options. So definitely a lot fewer options than in a block where you're dividing everything by 2 than when you're dividing a block into thirds. Depending though on how you feel about quilt math, or how you think you might feel about that quilt math, working in multiples of 2 can be a lot easier than working in things that have to keep multiples or factors of 3 in mind. This one you can have some fun with the colors. So depending on what direction you want your chain to go, you can have these blocks all the same color going on the upward diagonal, and then that downward diagonal you can have your blocks another color, and you're going to have these sort of like X lines crisscrossing throughout your quilt. And that one's really called an Irish chain, or one form of an Irish chain quilt. With these, once you've got a layout that you like and you start coloring things in with pencil crayons, then you can start to see how colors are going to make a difference in the way that your quilt will end up looking. Different color choices are going to create some some unique effects. So if you have solids and these two are the same color and those two are the same color, and then everything else kind of was off, and these were the same color again, and these were to match, you're from a distance going to end up with an kind of almost a bow tie look happening within those. So think about what you have for fabric available to you, and what you might like to try for different colors. So I decided that I liked the kind of bow tie idea. So next part, once you have enough of your squares laid out, is to begin coloring. So I selected a purple, a red, and a blue. And the parts that are just going to be kind of that bow tie look are going to be the ones that I color. I'm going to leave the other ones blank because they're just going to be my background pieces. With a quilt like this, where you see an object or a shape within your squares, you want to have a plain background, one that's going to make your other colors jump out. So if you've used some like really bright fabrics, you might want to use the black. It's going to make those bright fabrics really pop. Sometimes like gray is nice on a background, and so can white. It just depends on what you've chosen for colors and what you feel like will be the best neutral colored background to help your other parts kind of stand out. So I'm just going to start coloring my blocks here, and I'm going to do that on a harder surface than my my mat. So your coloring is really just an approximation. You do not need to be intense or at all perfect with it. It's just there as sort of to represent what everything's going to look like. have each of my bow ties colored out, and because I know that the rest of these are all going to be the same and a background color, I'm not going to color them in because it can be whatever I want it to be. But also there's the opportunity for two of these here to be combined into one single block, and that's something that I would recommend just to cut down on the amount of pieces that you're cutting and then sewing together. So what I'm going to do is cover one of these pieces over one of the larger rectangles over my two smaller ones, so that way I can see better how that's going to look. And if you're going to do something like create a rectangle followed by two smaller blocks, make sure that you're consistent with your construction of them. You don't want these rectangles to be kind of going this way on some and then running across the other way for others. The consistency will help you keep everything just kind of all together on track. And when you're building a quilt with all these pieces, having that routine will help prevent a sewing mistake. Another neat element with having these blocks is you can know if you have identical blocks and that don't necessarily look identical because of how they're laid out. So these two, because they're pointing in towards the center, if you're going like, oh man, that's like two whole different blocks to make, what you can do is lift them up and match them to see. And the reality is actually they're not. They are identical in their construction, but once they're turned into an opposite configuration, they create a different look. So that's the same with each of these. So if I were to turn them so they're all going the same way, you'll see that each of these blocks that have the small color in it, they're all the same. And in week 2, when we break down all the quilt math and talk about how to piece the quilt, we're going to go more in depth with looking at quilt orientation and how to line things up and lay it out, so that way it's easy to make your smaller block groupings together. Once you have the idea of your design down, make sure to take a photo of this so that you've got it saved. Then you're not wondering later on, once you've moved all of this around or packed it up and put it away for the day, how you had everything laid out. The other thing that you can do once you have your concept built and you've kind of manipulated and colored your squares to what you want them to be, but you want to see what your quilt might look like in the whole scheme of things, this is where graph paper is going to become your best friend. And you'll ultimately draw out the bigger blocks and the smaller blocks using graph paper and color them in, and that will give you an idea of how the whole thing might look, whether you want to try all kinds of different colors or you want to stick to just a couple of them that are alternating through. I think this one would be a really fun scrappy quilt where each bow tie is its own kind of unique fabric, if you have a whole bunch of fabrics available that you want to just use up. Or if this is one of your more first quilts and you don't have a lot of fabric options, but maybe you decide to buy a maybe like a fat quarter bundle, something that's got a bigger variety, then you can use those to create different kind of themes of bow ties. And once you have your kind of your larger block configured and put together, then you can move them around and decide on color spacing if you've got some colors that are too similar and you want to spread them out further. All kinds of design options a little bit later on, and we'll go into that when we get into more of the sewing videos and then kind of the bigger design wall features. Take as much time as you want to play around with your block choices. Take your time deciding on some colors for coloring them, and when you have something decided and put together, go ahead and share photos to either the Facebook group, on my Facebook page. We'd all love to be able to encourage each other and just enjoy everybody's creative ideas and arrangements that can come out of just a few of these square shapes. Have fun designing.